On your knees. Now. The command cut through the humid evening air like a siren, sharp and practiced, the kind of voice that expected obedience before the sentence even finished forming. And yet Naomi Carter didn't move. Not immediately. Not even when the red and blue lights washed over her face in slow, pulsing waves that reflected off the polished surface of the black SUV behind her, turning the parking lot into something surreal, almost staged, as if the moment had been rehearsed 100 times, but never quite. Like this, never with her. She stood there in worn work boots dusted with fine gray powder, the scent of motor oil still clinging faintly to her hoodie, one hand loosely at her side, the other holding a small paper bag that had gone slightly translucent from the warmth of whatever was inside. Her posture relaxed in a way that didn't match the tension gathering around her, and across from her, Agent Mark Reynolds adjusted his stance, one hand resting near his belt, the other gesturing downward. Again, firmer this time. "Ma'am, I'm not going to repeat myself." His tone controlled but edged with something else now. Something tighter, like a thread pulled just a little too far. Behind him, two other agents shifted subtly, their boots scraping against the asphalt, radios murmuring in clipped bursts, and a small crowd had already begun to form at the edges of the lot. People lingering by their cars, doors half open, engines idling, drawn in by the lights, by the authority, by the quiet. Spectacle of someone being singled out, and Naomi could feel their eyes without turning her head, could sense the assumptions settling in before a single word of explanation had been offered, the silent agreement that whatever was happening must be justified, must be deserved, because men like these didn't make mistakes, not out here, not like this. Reynolds took a step closer, closing the distance to just a few feet, his shadow stretching across the ground until it nearly touched her boots. "ID," he said, holding out his hand now, palm up, waiting, expecting, and for a brief second the only sound was the low hum of engines and the faint buzz of the overhead light flickering above the gas station sign. And Naomi finally shifted, just enough to tilt her head slightly, her eyes lifting to meet his, calm, steady, unreadable, the kind of gaze that didn't rise to confrontation but didn't lower itself either. And when she spoke her voice was even, almost quiet. "Do you have a warrant?" The question hung there, simple, precise, and for a fraction of a second something in the air changed, subtle but real, like a current shifting direction beneath still water, and Reynolds let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You're in no position to ask questions," he replied, louder now, aware of the audience, aware of the need to maintain control. And one of the agents behind him moved in slightly closer, as if to reinforce the moment, to tighten the circle. But Naomi didn't step back, didn't raise her voice, didn't even tighten her grip on the bag in her hand. She simply stood there, grounded, present, as if the flashing lights and the gathering crowd were just background noise to something only she could see clearly. And somewhere near the edge of the lot, a car door closed with a soft thud, a child's voice asking a question that no one answered, and the overhead light flickered again, casting a brief, stuttering shadow across Naomi's face that revealed, just for an instant, a faint line near her wrist, a scar that caught the light and disappeared just as quickly, unnoticed by everyone except the moment itself. As Reynolds reached forward, his patience thinning, his fingers brushing toward her arm, ready to turn instruction into action, ready to finish what he had already decided this situation was supposed to be. Reynolds's fingers closed around Naomi's wrist, firm but controlled, the kind of grip meant to signal authority more than force. And for a moment it seemed like the scene would follow the script everyone already believed in. The quiet compliance, the paperwork, the disappearance into the back of a government vehicle. But then something subtle shifted, not in the volume of the moment, but in its weight. Because Naomi did not pull away, did not tense, did not even look down at his hand. She simply adjusted her stance by half an inch, a small, almost invisible movement that changed the angle of her arm. And suddenly Reynolds's grip no longer held the same certainty it had a second ago. His brow tightened, not enough for the crowd to notice, but enough for the agent beside him to glance over. Sensing the hesitation, and Naomi's voice came again, steady, measured. "You should let go." Not a threat, not a plea, just a statement delivered with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. And that calm began to ripple outward, unsettling in its quiet confidence, because it did not match the role she had been placed into. One of the bystanders shifted their weight, keys jingling faintly, while a phone camera lifted slightly higher to capture the moment, and the flashing lights continued their slow rhythm, painting everything in alternating shades of red and blue, as if time itself was breathing. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, tightening his grip just a fraction, determined to reassert control. "You are being detained," he said, each word deliberate, rehearsed, and yet there was a faint crack beneath it now, something less certain, something searching for footing, and Naomi finally looked down, not at his face, but at his hand, her eyes tracing the placement of his fingers with quiet precision, the way someone might observe a detail that mattered more than it appeared. And then she moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just a smooth rotation of her wrist combined with a slight shift of her shoulder, a motion so efficient it barely disturbed the air between them, and in the next instant Reynolds's hand was no longer on her wrist. The release was clean, almost surgical, leaving no room for resistance because there had been nothing to resist, and for a brief second the world seemed to pause, the hum of engines fading into the background as Reynolds stared at his now empty hand, his mind catching up to something his body had not fully understood, and the agent to his left stepped forward instinctively, then stopped, unsure, because the situation no longer fit the pattern they were trained to follow. Naomi did not step back, did not advance. She simply lowered her arm again, the paper bag still intact in her other hand, as if none of it had been significant, and her eyes lifted once more, meeting Reynolds's with the same quiet steadiness. And in that look there was no challenge, no anger, only a kind of clarity that made the moment feel smaller than it had a second ago, as if the authority surrounding them had been placed under a light it was not used to. Somewhere behind the line of agents a radio crackled, a voice asking for a status update, but no one answered immediately, because Reynolds had not moved, his posture caught between command and confusion, and Naomi spoke again, softer this time, almost conversational. "You are doing this wrong." And the words landed heavier than they should have, not because of their volume, but because of the certainty behind them, a certainty that did not belong to someone who was supposed to be unsure. And for the first time since the lights had appeared, Reynolds hesitated, not outwardly, not in a way the crowd could easily name, but enough for the moment to tilt, just slightly, away from him. The silence stretched just long enough to become noticeable, the kind that made people shift uncomfortably without knowing why, and Reynolds felt it before he understood it. A subtle loss of rhythm in a situation that was supposed to follow a clear sequence, command, compliance, control, but now the sequence had fractured, and standing in front of him Naomi Carter did not look like someone waiting for instructions anymore. She looked like someone measuring them. The flashing lights continued to pulse across her face, but her expression did not change, calm in a way that did not ask for permission, and behind Reynolds one of the agents cleared his throat quietly, stepping half a pace closer as if to restore formation. "Sir," he murmured under his breath, but Reynolds did not respond immediately, his attention fixed on Naomi, trying to reconcile what had just happened with what he believed should have happened, because people did not simply slip out of his grip like that, not without struggle, not without tension, and yet there had been none, just a precise, almost effortless adjustment that left him standing there with nothing to hold on to. Naomi shifted her weight slightly, the faint creak of her boot against the asphalt barely audible, and for a brief second her gaze moved past Reynolds, toward the line of vehicles, where a young boy sat in the back seat of a sedan, his face pressed lightly against the window, eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear, and Naomi gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, a gesture so subtle it might have been missed by anyone not looking directly for it. Then her attention returned to Reynolds, steady as before, and when she spoke again her voice carried the same even tone, but there was a different layer beneath it now, something instructional, almost clinical. "You approached without verification, you escalated without cause, and now you are improvising." The words landed one after another, not accusatory, not loud, but precise, like someone listing facts rather than opinions. And Reynolds felt a flicker of irritation rise in his chest, because the calmness in her voice made the situation feel inverted, as if he had stepped into a role he had not agreed to play. That is enough, he said, sharper now, taking a step forward to reclaim the space between them. But even that step felt slightly off, as if the ground beneath it had shifted in a way only he could feel. One of the agents reached for his radio again, thumb hovering over the button, uncertain whether to speak or wait, while another glanced toward the gathering crowd, now larger. Phones raised higher, capturing every second, and Naomi did not react to any of it, her posture unchanged, her breathing slow and controlled. The paper bag still hanging lightly from her fingers as if the weight of the moment had no effect on it at all. Reynolds drew in a breath, preparing to speak again, to re-establish authority through sheer presence if nothing else. But before he could form the words, Naomi took a small step forward. Not aggressive, not challenging, just enough to close the distance by a fraction, and the movement alone was enough to interrupt him, because it was not the kind of step someone in her position was supposed to take. And for the first time a faint uncertainty surfaced in his expression, subtle but undeniable, as Naomi's eyes met his once more, unwavering, and she said quietly, "If this were a real operation, you would have lost control 2 minutes ago." And the statement did not echo, did not demand attention. It simply settled into the space between them, heavy in its certainty, leaving Reynolds standing there, aware now of something he had not considered before, that this moment, which had begun as routine, was no longer his to define. The words did not raise her voice, but they shifted the ground beneath the moment, and Reynolds felt it in the way his next breath did not come as easily as the last, in the way the edges of the scene no longer aligned with his expectations, because she was not reacting, she was observing, and worse, she was assessing. Behind him the radio finally crackled again, louder this time, the dispatcher repeating a request for status, and one of the agents answered quickly, voice tight, "Stand by," as if buying time could restore control. But time was no longer something they seemed to have ownership of, not in the way they had a few minutes ago. Naomi's gaze shifted briefly, not toward the agents, not toward the lights, but toward the small reflections in the glass of the nearby storefront, where every movement was mirrored back in fragments, angles and positions revealing more than direct sight ever could. And for a moment it became clear that she had been aware of every placement, every step, every hesitation from the beginning, not reacting to them, but mapping them. Reynolds straightened slightly, pulling his shoulders back, reclaiming posture if not certainty. "You are interfering with a federal procedure," he said, each word measured again, attempting to rebuild structure through language. But even as he spoke it felt rehearsed, like a line delivered a second too late. And Naomi tilted her head just slightly, not dismissive, not impressed, simply acknowledging the attempt. "Procedure requires clarity," she replied, her tone unchanged. "And you do not have it." And there was no challenge in her voice, only fact, which made it harder to dismiss. One of the agents stepped closer again, this time more cautiously, as if approaching something that did not behave the way it should, his hand hovering near his radio, eyes flicking between Reynolds and Naomi, waiting for direction that did not come, and the crowd at the edge of the lot had grown quieter now, the earlier murmurs fading into a kind of collective stillness, as if everyone sensed that something unseen was unfolding, something they could not name but could feel. Naomi shifted the paper bag from one hand to the other, a small, ordinary movement that seemed almost out of place in the tension, and for a brief second the smell of warm bread drifted faintly into the air, grounding the moment in something human, something simple, and that contrast made everything else feel sharper, the lights harsher, the silence heavier. Reynolds's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her more carefully now, not as a subject, but as a variable he had not accounted for. And for the first time he noticed the details he had missed before, the way her stance distributed weight evenly, balanced without rigidity, the way her breathing remained steady despite the pressure, the way her eyes moved not with uncertainty, but with intention, tracking, calculating. And a quiet realization began to form, not fully shaped yet, but enough to unsettle him, because this was not defiance, not resistance in the way he understood it. This was something else entirely, something structured, trained. Naomi met his gaze again, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them, filled only by the distant hum of traffic beyond the lot and the rhythmic pulse of the lights. And then, almost gently, she said, "Call it in," not as a suggestion, not as a command, but as the next logical step, and the simplicity of it made it impossible to ignore. Reynolds hesitated, just for a second, his hand hovering near his own radio now, caught between instinct and something new, something unfamiliar, and behind him one of the agents shifted again, uncertainty creeping into the edges of their formation, small gaps forming where there had been none before, and Naomi remained exactly where she was, still, composed, as if she had already moved past the outcome of this moment, and was simply waiting for them to catch up. Reynolds's hand hovered near his radio longer than it should have, long enough for the hesitation to become visible, not just to his team but to himself, and that realization settled in with a quiet weight he was not used to carrying, because hesitation was not part of his training, not in situations like this, not in front of witnesses, and yet the moment had shifted into something that no longer followed protocol. The radio crackled again, sharper this time, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the silence with a note of urgency, asking for confirmation, for clarity, for anything that would anchor the situation back into something recognizable. And one of the agents glanced at Reynolds, waiting, expecting the next move, but Reynolds did not answer immediately, his eyes still fixed on Naomi as if the answer he needed was standing right in front of him. Naomi did not rush him, did not repeat herself. She simply stood there, steady as before, the faint hum of the overhead light casting a soft glow across her face. And in that stillness there was something unmistakable now, not defiance, not resistance, but control, the kind that did not need to announce itself because it was already present. A car engine somewhere at the edge of the lot shut off with a low click, and the sudden absence of that sound made the quiet feel even deeper, more focused, as if the entire space had narrowed down to the few feet between them. Reynolds finally lifted the radio, pressing the button with a motion that felt heavier than it should have. "Dispatch, stand by," he said, his voice measured but lacking the certainty it carried before, and the response came immediately, questioning, pressing, but he released the button before answering further, lowering the radio slowly as if buying himself another second to think. Naomi watched the movement without comment, her gaze tracking not the device but the decision behind it, and then, almost as if acknowledging the shift, she adjusted her stance slightly, turning just enough that the light caught the edge of her sleeve, revealing a faint, almost hidden stitching near the cuff, a detail so small it could easily be dismissed, but in this moment it stood out, precise, deliberate, like everything else about her. One of the agents behind Reynolds shifted again, his voice lower now, uncertain. "Sir, we need direction," and the words hung there, exposing the gap that had formed, the space where command was supposed to be, and Reynolds felt it, the expectation pressing in from all sides, from his team, from the watching crowd, from the system he represented, and yet none of it aligned with what was in front of him anymore. Naomi's voice broke the silence again, softer now, almost reflective. "You came here expecting compliance," she said, not accusing, not correcting, just stating what had already been understood. And then she added, "But you never confirmed who you were dealing with." And the simplicity of it made it land harder than any confrontation could have, because it pointed to something fundamental, something overlooked. Reynolds's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes narrowing as he replayed the last few minutes in his mind. Each step, each assumption, each decision made without question. And for the first time he saw the gaps, small at first, then widening, until the entire structure felt less stable than it had moments ago. The radio crackled once more, louder now. The dispatcher's voice edged with impatience. And this time Reynolds did not hesitate as long, his thumb pressing the button again. But before he could speak, Naomi tilted her head just slightly, her eyes steady on his, and said quietly, "You should ask the right question." And the words did not interrupt him, they redirected him, subtle but unmistakable. And for a brief second his thumb paused against the button, caught between what he had planned to say and what he now realized he needed to know. And in that pause the entire scene seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which path he would choose. Reynolds felt the words settle into him before he fully understood them, not loud, not forceful, but precise enough to redirect his thinking in a way that training alone could not override. and his thumb remained still against the radio button for a fraction longer than anyone expected, long enough for the agent beside him to glance over again, this time with something closer to concern than anticipation, while the dispatcher's voice continued to filter through the static, repeating the request, asking for clarity, for status, for confirmation that no longer came as easily as it should have. The flashing lights reflected across Naomi's face in slow intervals, but her expression did not change, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, as if the outcome of this moment had already been calculated and filed away somewhere beyond what anyone else in the lot could see. And that calm began to feel less like composure and more like control, the kind that did not need to escalate because it was already ahead. Reynolds finally released the radio without speaking, lowering it slightly as his eyes remained locked on hers. And for the first time since the encounter began, the question forming in his mind was not procedural, it was personal, not who she was on paper, but who she was in this moment, standing here, unshaken, unhurried, as if the entire situation had been reduced to something smaller than it appeared. Behind him, one of the agents shifted his stance again, adjusting his grip on his equipment, not out of action but out of uncertainty, a subtle movement that echoed the shift already taking place in the formation, small gaps widening where there had been none, and the crowd at the edge of the lot had gone nearly silent now, phones still raised but voices absent, as if everyone sensed that whatever came next would not fit the story they had expected to witness. Naomi's gaze moved briefly, not away, but through the scene, catching reflections in glass, angles of movement, the placement of each person as if she were assembling a map in real time. And then she returned her attention to Reynolds, her eyes steady, grounded, and when she spoke again her voice carried that same quiet clarity. "Ask who cleared this," she said, not instructing him how to act, but guiding him toward what mattered, and the distinction was subtle but undeniable. Reynolds inhaled slowly, the air feeling heavier now, more deliberate, and this time when he raised the radio again, his movement was different, less automatic, more intentional, his thumb pressing the button with a measured pause before he spoke. "Dispatch," he began, his voice steady but quieter than before. "Confirm authorization on this stop," and the words, simple as they were, shifted the balance of the moment once more, because they acknowledged something he had not questioned before, and as the radio responded with a brief delay, static filling the gap where certainty should have been, Reynolds felt it clearly now, the realization that the ground beneath this entire situation had never been as solid as he assumed. Naomi did not react to the call, did not show satisfaction or concern. She simply stood there, waiting, the paper bag still warm in her hand, the faint scent of bread lingering in the air, grounding the moment in something real, something human, and in that contrast the tension sharpened again, not louder, not more aggressive, but more defined, as if everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only the truth of what remained. And for the first time Reynolds understood that this was no longer about control, it was about clarity, and that clarity was not coming from him. The response did not come right away, and that delay stretched thin across the air like a wire pulled too tight, humming quietly beneath the flashing lights, and Reynolds felt every second of it as the radio remained pressed near his mouth, the static filling the space where certainty should have been, until finally a voice broke through, less confident than before, more cautious, "Stand by, verifying." And that single phrase landed heavier than any direct answer could have, because it confirmed what Naomi had already implied, that something about this situation had not been fully established. Reynolds lowered the radio slowly, his grip tightening just slightly as his eyes remained fixed on Naomi, searching now not for compliance but for understanding, for context, for the piece he had missed from the beginning. And Naomi met his gaze without resistance, without urgency, simply present, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment, not to win, not to prove anything, but to allow the truth to surface on its own. Behind him, one of the agents shifted again, his voice low, uncertain. "Sir, dispatch is delayed." And another glance toward the vehicles, scanning the area as if expecting something else to emerge, some external factor that would restore the structure they relied on. But nothing changed except the growing awareness that the structure itself had been incomplete. Naomi adjusted her grip on the paper bag, the faint crinkle of it breaking the silence for just a second, and the simple, ordinary sound contrasted sharply with the tension surrounding them, grounding the moment in a way that made everything else feel more exposed, more real. And Reynolds noticed it, the normalcy of it, the way she held on to something small and human while standing in the center of something much larger. And that contrast unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. The crowd at the edge of the lot had grown still, their earlier curiosity now replaced with quiet attention, as if they sensed that the story they thought they were watching had shifted into something else entirely, something less predictable. And Naomi's eyes moved once more, briefly, catching the reflections in the storefront glass, the angles of the agents, the spacing between them, the placement of the vehicles, all of it registering in a way that suggested awareness far beyond the surface of the moment. And then she returned her focus to Reynolds, her expression unchanged, steady, composed. The radio crackled again, louder this time, and Reynolds lifted it instinctively, his thumb pressing the button as the voice on the other end spoke with a different tone. Now, more deliberate. Unit, confirms subject identity, and the phrasing itself shifted the balance again, because it no longer assumed, it questioned, and Reynolds hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering, his voice measured. Adult female. No identification provided. And even as he said it, the words felt incomplete, insufficient, as if they described only a fraction of what was standing in front of him. There was a pause on the line, longer this time, followed by a quieter response, almost careful. Copy, continue verification. And the line went still again, leaving the air between them heavier than before, filled with the absence of certainty. Naomi watched him lower the radio once more, and for the first time there was the slightest shift in her expression, not a smile, not satisfaction, but something softer, almost like recognition, as if he had finally reached the point she had been guiding him toward. And when she spoke again, her voice carried that same calm clarity. You are closer now, she said, and the words were not praise, not encouragement, just an acknowledgement of movement, of progress, and Reynolds felt it, the shift inside the moment, the realization that this was no longer about asserting control, it was about understanding what he had stepped into, and for the first time since the lights had turned on, he did not reach for authority, he reached for clarity, standing there in the quiet, aware that whatever came next would not come from assumption, but from truth that had been there all along, waiting to be recognized. The words lingered in the air longer than expected, not because they were dramatic, but because they settled into a space that had already been stripped of assumptions, and Reynolds felt them echo in a way that made him aware of everything he had overlooked, every step taken without confirmation, every decision made too quickly, and for the first time he did not feel the need to respond immediately, because the urgency that had driven him earlier had faded, replaced by something quieter, something more deliberate. The radio remained still in his hand, silent now, and the absence of sound from it carried its own message, one that none of the agents spoke out loud but all of them felt, that whatever authority they believed they had brought into this moment was now being questioned from somewhere. Beyond their immediate reach, Naomi stood exactly where she had been, unchanged, her presence steady in a way that did not demand attention but held it nonetheless. And as the overhead light flickered softly above, its reflection traced along the edge of her sleeve once more, catching on the stitching near her cuff, that same faint detail that had gone unnoticed before, but now seemed intentional, as if it had always been there waiting for the right moment to be seen. One of the agents shifted. Again, this time stepping back half a pace, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty, the kind that made people reconsider their position without fully understanding why. And the formation that had once felt tight and controlled now showed small gaps, subtle but undeniable, like cracks forming in something that had been assumed to be solid. Reynolds noticed it, not just in his team, but in himself. The way his stance had adjusted without him realizing, the way his voice, when he finally spoke, again, carried less force and more thought. If there is something we need to know, he began, the words slower now, measured differently. Now would be the time to say it. And the statement was not a demand, not a command, but an opening, a shift from control to inquiry. Naomi regarded him for a moment, her eyes steady, and then she moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet precision she had shown from the beginning, her hand reaching toward the edge of her sleeve. Fingers brushing lightly against the cuff where the stitching had caught the light before, and she adjusted it slightly, revealing just enough of what lay beneath to change the atmosphere without fully explaining it. A small, deliberate motion that carried more weight than any explanation could have. Reynolds's gaze followed the movement, his focus narrowing as he took in the detail, not fully understanding it yet, but recognizing that it mattered, that it was part of something larger, something structured, and the realization settled in slowly, building piece by piece rather than all at once. The crowd at the edge of the lot leaned in almost imperceptibly, their earlier curiosity now sharpened into attention, as if they sensed that the moment was approaching something definitive, something that would reshape everything that had come before it. Naomi let her hand fall back to her side, the paper bag still in her grasp, the warmth of it still present, grounding her in the ordinary even as the extraordinary unfolded around her. And when she spoke again, her voice remained calm, unchanged, but the meaning behind it carried further now, reaching into the space that had been cleared of assumptions. "You came here with a story already written," she said, "but you did not check if it was true." And the words did not accuse, did not confront, they simply revealed, and in that revelation Reynolds felt the final shift, the moment where control gave way completely to understanding, even if that understanding was not yet fully formed. And as the lights continued to pulse and the silence held steady, it became clear to everyone present that whatever this situation had been at the start, it was no longer that anymore. The air held steady after her words, not collapsing into noise, not breaking into argument, but settling into something quieter, something that felt closer to truth than authority. And Reynolds felt it fully now, the weight of a moment that had shifted beyond his control without ever becoming chaotic. And that realization unsettled him more than anything else, because it meant the situation had not escalated. It had evolved. Naomi remained still, her presence unchanged, and yet everything around her felt different, as if the space itself had adjusted to her rhythm instead of the other way around. And the faint glow from the overhead light traced along her sleeve again, catching that same subtle detail near her cuff, now impossible to ignore. And Reynolds's eyes lingered there a fraction longer this time, not fully understanding but no longer dismissing it either. Behind him, one of the agents lowered his radio slightly, the earlier urgency replaced with hesitation, while another shifted his stance in a way that suggested uncertainty rather than readiness. And the formation that had once been tight now felt loose, undefined, as if it was waiting for something to re-establish its purpose. The crowd at the edge of the lot remained silent, their attention fixed, phones still raised but forgotten in their hands, because the moment had moved beyond spectacle into something more deliberate, something that demanded understanding rather than reaction. Reynolds drew in a slow breath, his posture no longer rigid but not relaxed either, caught in that space between command and reconsideration. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different tone, less force, more clarity. "Then tell me what we missed," he said. And the words did not challenge her, they acknowledged her, and that acknowledgement marked the shift more clearly than anything else had. Naomi regarded him for a moment, her gaze steady, and then she moved again, not stepping forward, not retreating, but lifting her hand slightly, just enough to adjust the edge of her sleeve once more, this time revealing a fraction more of what had been hidden, a small insignia stitched with precision, worn but unmistakable in its structure. And though it was only visible for a second before the fabric settled back into place, it was enough, more than enough, because it carried meaning that did not need explanation. Reynolds's eyes narrowed slightly as he processed the detail, his mind reaching for recognition, for context, for anything that could connect what he had just seen with what he understood. And in that moment the radio in his hand crackled again, sharper this time, the voice on the other end no longer uncertain but deliberate. "Unit, stand down pending verification." And the words landed with quiet authority, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that shifted everything again. Reynolds did not respond immediately, his gaze still on Naomi, the pieces beginning to align in a way that felt both sudden and inevitable, as if the answer had been present from the beginning and he had only just allowed himself to see it. And Naomi, for the first time, allowed the faintest change in her expression, not a smile, not triumph, but something softer, something closer to recognition, as if he had finally reached the point where the truth no longer needed to be guided. The lights continued to pulse across the scene, but their intensity felt different now, less dominating, more distant, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with understanding that had taken time to surface. And as Reynolds lowered the radio slowly, his grip loosening, it became clear that whatever this encounter had been at the start, it had transformed into something else entirely, something that could no longer be resolved through assumption, only through acknowledgement of what had been standing in front of him all along. The words from the radio did not echo, but they settled with a quiet finality that no one could ignore, and Reynolds felt them land deeper than any direct command he had received all evening, not because they were louder, but because they confirmed what had already begun to take shape in his mind, that this moment was no longer his to control, only to respond to. And as he stood there with the radio still in his hand, the weight of that realization shifted something in his posture, subtle but unmistakable, the rigidity, easing just enough to make room for clarity. The agents behind him sensed it immediately, their movements slowing, their earlier readiness replaced with a cautious stillness, as if they were waiting for a new direction that had not yet been spoken, and the formation that had once been tight and defined now held itself in a loose alignment, no longer pressing forward, no longer assuming, simply present. Naomi remained exactly where she had been, her stance unchanged, her breathing steady, the paper bag still warm in her hand, and the faint scent of bread lingered in the air, grounding the moment in something simple and real, a quiet contrast to the layered tension that had built around her. And as the overhead light flickered once more, its glow traced along her sleeve again, catching the edge of that same insignia beneath the fabric, no longer just a detail, but a signal, something that had been there from the beginning, waiting to be recognized rather than revealed. Reynolds lowered the radio slowly, his grip loosening as he processed the shift, and for the first time since the encounter began, he did not feel the need to assert authority, because authority no longer defined the moment. Understanding did, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried that change, quieter, more measured. "Dispatch has us standing down," he said, not as an order, but as a statement of fact. And the words moved through the group with a subtle effect, shoulders easing, stances adjusting, the tension dispersing in small, controlled increments rather than breaking all at once. One of the agents exhaled softly, another lowered his radio completely, and the faint hum of the environment began to return, the distant sound of traffic, the low buzz of the overhead light, the quiet movement of people at the edges of the lot, all of it filling in the space that had been held by uncertainty. Reynolds's gaze returned to Naomi, not searching now, not questioning, but acknowledging, and in that acknowledgement there was something new, something that had not been present before, respect, not declared, not spoken, but understood, and Naomi met his gaze with the same calm she had carried from the beginning, unchanged, steady, as if nothing about her had shifted, only the way she was seen. For a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer tense, but settled, and then Reynolds gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, a gesture that carried more weight than any formal statement could have, and Naomi responded in kind, not mirroring the nod exactly, but allowing a slight softening in her expression, a recognition of the shift that had taken place. The flashing lights continued to pulse, but they felt distant now, less intrusive, more like remnants of a moment that had already passed, and the crowd at the edge of the lot began to move again, slowly, quietly, as if the scene had concluded without ever needing a clear ending. And as Naomi adjusted her sleeve once more, letting the fabric fall back into place, the insignia hidden again beneath it, she turned slightly, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that the moment had reached its natural close, and Reynolds watched her for a second longer, aware now that what had unfolded here was not a disruption, not a confrontation, but a correction, one that had not been forced, but revealed, and in that realization there was a quiet understanding that would remain long after the lights were turned off and the lot returned to its ordinary stillness. Naomi turned just enough to shift her weight toward the edge of the lot, the motion unhurried, unforced, as if she were stepping out of something that had already resolved itself long before anyone else realized it. And the soft sound of her boots against the asphalt carried in the quiet that followed, a quiet no longer filled with tension, but with something steadier, something closer to understanding. Reynolds watched her for a second longer than necessary, not out of suspicion now, but out of reflection, his mind replaying the sequence of moments that had brought them here, each detail aligning differently than it had before, each assumption revealing itself as incomplete. And the realization settled into him not as regret, but as awareness, the kind that does not announce itself but stays. Behind him, one of the agents shifted again, this time lowering his shoulders fully, the earlier rigidity gone, replaced by a more grounded stance, while another glanced toward Reynolds, as if expecting a final confirmation, something to close the loop, and Reynolds responded with a small, almost imperceptible nod, enough to signal that the situation had ended, not through force, but through clarity. The flashing lights continued to pulse, but their presence felt diminished now, less central, more like an afterimage of something that had already passed, and the crowd at the edge of the lot began to disperse in small, quiet movements, doors closing softly, engines starting again, conversations resuming in low tones, as if the moment they had witnessed did not require explanation, only acknowledgement. Naomi walked a few steps further, the paper bag still in her hand, its warmth fading slowly into the evening air, and as she passed the reflection of the storefront glass, her image moved across it in fragments, light and shadow tracing her outline, steady, composed, unchanged, and for a brief second she paused, not turning back, not stopping fully, just enough to let the moment settle behind her. Reynolds took a slow breath, the air feeling different now, less charged, more real, and he lowered his gaze briefly to his own hands, noticing the absence of tension in them, the way his grip had loosened without him realizing it. And when he looked up again, Naomi was already a few steps further away, her presence receding from the center of the scene but not from his awareness. One of the agents approached him quietly, his voice low. "Sir, are we clearing out?" And Reynolds answered without hesitation this time. "Yes," his tone calm, steady, no longer driven by urgency, but by decision. And the team began to move, not quickly, not abruptly, but with a measured efficiency that reflected the shift that had taken place. Equipment adjusted, radios lowered, vehicles repositioned. As Reynolds turned slightly, preparing to follow, his gaze caught once more on the space Naomi had occupied, the empty spot now holding only the faint echo of what had unfolded there. And in that space he recognized something he had not expected to encounter tonight. Not resistance, not conflict, but a correction, quiet and precise, that had not needed to raise its voice to be understood. Naomi continued walking, her steps even, her posture unchanged, blending back into the ordinary flow of the evening, as if she had never stood at the center of anything at all. And as the lights behind her dimmed and the sound of engines settled into the background, the moment closed not with a command or a conclusion, but with a simple, lasting shift in perspective, one that would remain long after the scene itself had faded into memory. The night settled back into itself as Naomi moved farther from the glow of the lights, the red and blue reflections fading from her shoulders until they disappeared entirely, replaced by the softer, more ordinary shadows of the street, and the quiet rhythm of her steps returned to something unremarkable, the kind that blended into the background of a city that rarely noticed who passed through it. Behind her, the last of the vehicles shifted position, engines turning over with low, controlled hums, and the agents moved with a different energy now, not urgent, not rigid, but measured, as if each motion carried a trace of the awareness they had just gained, something subtle but permanent. Reynolds lingered for a moment longer than the rest, standing near the edge of the lot where the scene had unfolded, his gaze tracing the path Naomi had taken, not to follow, not to call her back, but to understand the distance she had already created without effort. And as he stood there, the overhead light flickered once more, casting a brief, uneven glow across the empty space where she had been, and for a second it felt like the moment itself was replaying, not visually, but in the quiet recollection of what had shifted. One of the agents approached him again, slower this time, his voice lower. "Everything is clear, sir." And Reynolds nodded, not immediately responding. His attention still anchored to the absence Naomi had left behind, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried that same calm clarity he had begun to find earlier. "Then we are done here." And the words were simple, final, without the need for emphasis. The agent nodded and turned away, relaying the instruction to the rest of the team, and within moments the structure that had formed so tightly at the beginning of the encounter dissolved into something more fluid, more human. Radios clipped back into place, doors closing with quiet precision, the scene returning to its original shape, without the weight it had carried before. Reynolds exhaled slowly, the breath steady, and he glanced down at his radio for a brief moment before clipping it back onto his belt, the motion deliberate, as if acknowledging that what had just occurred would not be resolved through another call, another confirmation, but through something internal, something that would remain with him long after this night ended. Naomi continued walking, her figure now smaller in the distance, blending into the flow of the evening, passing by storefronts and streetlights that reflected briefly across her path, and then moved on, leaving no trace. And as she reached the corner, she paused just long enough to adjust her sleeve once more, the fabric falling neatly into place, the insignia beneath it hidden again. Not erased, just unseen, as if it had always belonged to a different layer of the world, one that did not need recognition to exist. Reynolds watched from afar, his posture steady, his expression thoughtful, and in that distance there was no longer tension, no conflict, only a quiet understanding that what had happened here had not been about authority or defiance, but about perspective, about seeing clearly what had been missed. And as Naomi turned the corner and disappeared from view, the space she left behind did not feel empty. It felt resolved, as if something had been corrected without ever needing to be forced. And the night continued on, unchanged on the surface, but carrying within it a shift that would not fade as easily as the lights that had once defined it. The corner swallowed her presence as quietly as it had revealed it, and for a moment the space she left behind felt suspended, as if the night itself was holding onto the last trace of something it did not fully understand but could not ignore. And Reynolds stood there just a second longer than necessary, his eyes fixed on the empty stretch of sidewalk where she had disappeared, not expecting her to return, but aware that something had shifted in a way that would not simply fade with distance. The hum of the engines behind him grew steadier, more routine, and one by one the vehicles eased into motion, their lights dimming as they pulled away from the lot, leaving behind only the faint glow of the overhead fixture and the quiet residue of what had taken place. And as the last car door shut with a soft, final click, the space returned to something ordinary, almost unremarkable, yet undeniably altered. Reynolds turned slowly, his movements no longer driven by urgency, but by reflection. And as he walked toward his vehicle, his steps measured against the asphalt, he noticed the details he had overlooked earlier, the subtle marks on the ground, the reflection of light in the glass, the way sound carried differently once tension had lifted, and each detail seemed sharper now, not because they had changed, but because his perception had. He reached his door and paused, his hand resting briefly on the handle, and for a moment he did not open it, instead allowing the quiet to settle fully around him. The kind of quiet that does not demand attention but offers it, and in that stillness the events of the evening aligned with a clarity that had not been available before, not because new information had appeared, but because he had finally seen what had always been there. Across the street, a distant streetlight flickered once, then steadied, casting a soft, even glow over the empty pavement, and Reynolds exhaled slowly, the breath grounding him in the present, in the understanding that what had occurred was not an interruption, not a disruption of order, but a correction of perspective, one that had required no force, no escalation, only recognition. He opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, the interior light briefly illuminating his face before fading as the door closed. And for a second he sat there, without starting the engine, his hands resting lightly on the wheel, his posture relaxed in a way it had not been at the start of the night. And as he looked out through the windshield, the reflection of the overhead light no longer felt harsh, no longer demanded control. It simply existed, steady and neutral, somewhere in the distance, The faint sound of footsteps echoed briefly, then disappeared, blending into the rhythm of the city, and though Naomi was no longer visible, her presence lingered in the way the moment had unfolded, in the way it had resolved without confrontation, without declaration, leaving behind something quieter but far more lasting. Reynolds started the engine, the low hum filling the cabin, and as he pulled out of the lot, the tires rolling smoothly over the pavement, he did not look back, not because there was nothing to see, but because there was nothing left to question, and as the scene receded behind him, the night continued as it always did, lights flickering, cars passing, people moving through their own paths, unaware of the small shift that had taken place, a shift, not in the world itself, but in how it was seen, and that was enough, because she had not needed to change the situation, she had simply revealed it, and in doing so, she left behind something no authority could command and no assumption could erase, the quiet reminder that understanding does not come from power, but from the willingness to see clearly what stands in front of you.